The Minds of Meaning Podcast. The Minds of Meaning Podcast. A podcast where we grow together in understanding the unique ways that God has created us. Here's our host, Austin Anderson.
Welcome to the Minds of Meaning Podcast, a podcast where we understand the unique ways that God has created us. My name is Austin Anderson. The next 5 episodes are a part of a sub-podcast series about Christian educational leadership and communication leadership. As you may have heard, I am currently pursuing my doctorate in educational leadership and policy studies at Judson University in Elgin, Illinois. As a project towards graduation, I am producing this mini podcast series to gain insight into how effective communication can lead to positive relationships within educational leadership. This first week, I have on Dr. Donna Elkins, who serves as the Associate Vice President of Regional Administration at Campbellsville University in Campbellsville, Kentucky, where she oversees 5 academic and operational functions in multiple states, serves on the President's Cabinet, and is a member of the Provost's Office. Prior to that, she was the Dean of Online Education and the Director of Teaching and Learning at Spalding University in Louisville. She also had stints as faculty and administration at Jefferson Community and Technical College in Louisville, the University of Kentucky, and Maysville Community College in Maysville, Kentucky. She is also adjuncted at 4 additional universities. She received her doctorate in organizational communication at the University of Kentucky and has received a master's in political science at Louisville, a master's in mass communication and journalism at Morehead State University, and is working toward another master's degree in biblical studies with emphasis in theology at Kentucky Christian University. Her undergraduate studies were at Morehead State in journalism and in government. She brings a lot of variety of experience and expertise into this conversation. I hope you enjoy our discussion with Dr. Donna Elkins. You have quite the resume and a vast resume of scholarly work in the field of communication and the field of leadership in general. Do you mind sharing with us your career journey and how you became passionate about studying the fields of communication as well as leadership?
Well, I think from the earliest age, I was very drawn by storytelling and grew up reading a lot. Lived out in the country, pretty far away from everything. So that was really my entertainment. And I wanted to be a writer myself. So I went into journalism initially and did write for some small newspapers when I was in college. I first came out of school and thought at one point that I would go to law school. And wisely decided that was not the best path. But I moved into public relations office at a small community college. And I had always loved school, but I never really thought about education as a career path and loved my time at that college. Had the opportunity to do a lot of different things. I worked with job training directly with students, started teaching a little bit, wrote grants and managed grants. And so I got a wide range of experience during the years I was there and decided that I wanted to stay in higher ed. And so I went back to get my doctorate. And I decided on communication because I realized that in all of the different kinds of work that I had done, the foundation of them all was relationships and building relationships and being able to work with other people. And so I decided on interpersonal and organizational communication. And when I came out of my graduate program, I went back into a larger community college, initially in additional research, and then faculty position, and then kind of worked my way back up there into leadership. So, I've always had interest in a lot of different kinds of things. I've stayed in higher education for the last, I guess now it's probably been 25 or 30 years. And I've had the opportunity to do a lot of different things, both in the classroom and teaching, and also in some leadership roles. Like I mentioned, I was never one of those people who wanted to just study one specific area for the rest of my life. So even in my scholarship, I've kind of had a wide range between mass communication and journalism, political science, which was related to mass media, and then an interpersonal and organizational comm as well.
You have all these different understandings, and you've had some studies specifically more geared towards leadership and some geared more towards communication. What are some similarities and differences that you've found between your studies within communication and your studies within leadership?
Well, I think, as I mentioned earlier, the primary thing is relationship. I think that relationships are the foundation for both of those. Empathy with others, developing emotional intelligence, all of those are the same skills that make you a strong communicator. I think can also help you to become a good leader, being able to motivate and persuade other people and encourage them where they are. But I would say with leadership, to me, leadership, I think of it as more goal-oriented. That, I'm walking into this relationship, and a lot of times there are certain boundaries and parameters that would not be there in just a typical relationship that I might have with someone as a family member or a friend or even a colleague. And so leadership is much more intentional and much more focused on reaching our goals.
Most certainly. I love that balance between reaching those goals and being able to communicate to get there, and that there's certainly that overlap between the two, most certainly. In research, maybe for some of us who are listening to this, we're not quite sure about what some research elements are, but for those of us who are doing research in our communities, there's something that we call scholarly giants, or people that we kind of look towards to who are some of the people that we have found to be so impactful in our research studies. Who are some of these people that you have come across here, Dr. Elkins, and why were they so important to you throughout the midst of your research?
Well, the first one I think of is someone that I met in graduate school, Charles Berger. And I actually ended up writing a dissertation in the area of uncertainty reduction theory, which was probably what he's best known for. But when I met him, he was actually kind of switching gears a little bit to focus on planning and goals. And I was just always really drawn to the rationality of his theories, but knowing that we are not just rational creatures. Sometimes we're not rational at all. So I was always interested in his work and have used it a lot over the years. Sandra Petronio is another. For a few years, I was focused a lot on social support, and especially social support for cancer survivors in the workplace and doing work with some of the support groups and other things. And so her communication privacy management theory was very important to me and still is. Unfortunately, I believe that she passed recently, but I had the opportunity to meet with her a couple of times. Actually, I went to a conference one time and I was presenting on privacy management, and she was in the audience, and I didn't know it until after I got there. So you talk about intimidated, but she was so gracious and she came up and talked with me afterwards. So that was really important to me. My dissertation advisor at the University of Kentucky, Robert Bostrom, he had written quite a bit about listening. And so he had some influence definitely on some of my work. And then the last one I'll mention is where I've sort of been going recently with my research is in the communication theory of resilience. And so Patrice Buzinel is the primary theorist in that area, and have not had the opportunity to meet her, but just really appreciate her work and what it can tell us about the role that communication plays in being able to work your way through hardships and difficult times.
You kind of tailored a little bit of that into your research. And so obviously there's people that you've researched that you work with when you went through your dissertation process. Are there any other voices that maybe are more modern that you've been able to study or research that really have hit the point in terms of effective communication and leadership?
For the last about 10 years, I've been in liberal art, Christ-focused Christian institutions. Although I've been a Christian all my life, it's been a unique experience to try to think about how those things work together, which is kind of new for me. But I will say that recently, I consider him a communication scholar to a degree, even though his field, I think, is in computer technology, is Cal Newport. He really speaks to me. I've read his World Without Email and have wished that I lived in that world. Parker Palmer also, I think that even though he doesn't write specifically about communication or leadership, so many of the things that he writes about are applicable to both. I have worked with a professor at Kentucky Christian University, Robert Schoaf, who teaches in theology there, but actually his specialty is in intercultural studies. And he has opened my eyes to just so many things about the way that we read scripture and the way that we communicate with each other as Christians that may not be the practice in other cultures. And so that's been really eye-opening for me. And then there's a couple other folks. One is someone who's sort of popular, I think, but Susan Cain, who writes about introverts I've had so many people and students over the years who wanted to talk about the fact that they were introverts and really wanted to be in the field of communication, either in mass media or organizational communication, but felt like that might be close to them as an introvert. And so I really have relied heavily on her work. And then I'll mention one more because I just read his book not too long ago, and that's Richard Stearns. He was the CEO of World Vision. Before that, he was CEO at several other companies, but he wrote a book called Lead Like It Matters to God. And again, even though he had not always been in a mission-oriented organization, just hearing about how he saw his leadership as a service to God was really impactful for me.
What do you think are like the leading causes of communication currently being so divisive here in the 21st century? And how has that affected educational leadership, if at all, in your mind?
Well, I think there's just an inability to appreciate or listen to someone who does not hold your same thoughts or does not look at the world the way you do. And that's so unfortunate because it really does limit your perspective, your ability to understand, just as I was talking about with intercultural studies. I mean, there are things that I read or see or hear that I'm thinking it's difficult sometimes to appreciate it when it's so diverse from your own experience, your own perspective. But at the university that I'm currently at Campbellsville, we are actually doing our QEP on civil discourse. And so one of the things that we are focused on is being able to listen. It doesn't mean that you have to agree with the other person, but being able to expand enough to listen to the other side. And maybe you walk away not agreeing. And I feel like there's this expectation these days that everyone has to agree with you or somehow that's offending you. So we can disagree without you being offensive to me or me being offensive to you. And I really do think that that's the heart of the matter, is getting back to a point where we can have a discourse without just shutting people down that we disagree with. And it has affected educational leadership because I think it is our responsibility as leaders, especially with young adults, to try and help them navigate these waters. And it's not easy. And of course, we're not perfect and we don't do it perfectly either. But to try and be role models and model for them what it means to engage in lively discourse.
And as I mentioned just previously, you have that MA in political science. So I'm just curious, what led you to study that field and how did that give you a different perspective on communication and leadership as you progressed in your scholarly journey?
As I mentioned before, I have an undergraduate degree in government. I had a double major in journalism and government. And I did that because, as I mentioned earlier, I thought at one point that I would go to law school. And actually, it was after I finished my doctorate and I was working at an institution where we had tuition reimbursements at other states, universities in the state. And so I decided to go to the local university. And I just really was going to take a couple of classes. I was really interested in media and campaigns. And I was just going to take a couple political science classes in that area and got drawn into how policy is structured and thinking about how policies actually affect our daily lives. And before you know it, I had taken enough coursework to complete the degree. And I wrote a thesis about the kind of two-step process, what influences people to vote the way that they do vote in presidential elections, which was kind of interesting to look at. I used a national database to look at the influence of your neighbors and family and the people that you talk to versus the official campaign and mass media messages that you hear. And that's kind of where I went with that. I did for a while teach a media and politics class, but over the last few years, I think like everybody else, just wanted to step away from political discourse and give that a break.
Something unique about your career, and you mentioned this before, you've spent time at public institutions, private liberal arts institutions, CCCU schools. I mean, you've been really all over the map in that. What are some unique characteristics of being an educator within a small liberal arts school that one can experience in a different setting, and probably more from a leadership perspective? What are some nuances that are special about leading in a school that's a CCCU school?
Well, I think that there is a connection across disciplines that you just don't see in larger public institutions. I've taught at a couple of research ones over my years, and you're very silent there. And so thinking about the way that you're interacting with students, and as a leader, I would say the way that you're interacting with students and how you can bring different disciplines together. At my previous institution, I was the director for our Center for Teaching and Learning and worked a lot with online education. And one of the things that we did was we intentionally brought together faculty from across disciplines to do scholarship together, to co-teach some things together, just to do projects together. And I think that's something that can happen in small liberal arts institutions that doesn't happen in some of the larger kinds of institutions. And I think there's a difference in the reason that scholars and teachers and administrators and leaders come into the small CCCU schools. It's for the love of what you're doing and also, wanting to be of service, wanting to have a larger impact on students, knowing the students well, being involved in extracurricular kinds of things, going to chapel with those students. And I think it impacts the leadership in the way that you lead because the kind of scholars who are attracted to those institutions really come for the love of it and for what they can do for students. At least that's been my experience.
How is the importance of the utilization of having a Christian belief or the use of Christian principles specifically help you in terms of leadership conflict or motivation in certain situations?
Well, because I've sat on the leadership teams, I've certainly seen times when we were in conflicts. And just because we all have a common purpose or common mission does not mean that there aren't times where we're at odds with each other. And one of the things that I've really appreciated about being in a school where every individual has that Christian belief is that there is a level of respect in that. And, when we were talking about discourse and how divisive things have become, one of the things I probably should have said is we respect each other as created human beings in the image of God. And so even if we're in conflict, that is still in our minds. I've been in situations a lot of times where we'll stop and pray, or maybe we'll pray before we go into a situation together because we know that there is going to be conflict. I think letting go of the ego, and it's so easy, and I know I did this early in my career too. I was really focused on what I wanted, what my next step in my career might be, or something along those lines. And of course, as you mature and as you move through, it's much easier to start letting go of your ego and not feeling like you have to be the attention and you have to get what you want, but actually trying to think about things from a larger perspective. And so I think as a Christian, we have higher goals. At the end of the day, our goal is, to please our Father and not necessarily to please anybody else, but to treat others with that level of respect. And I think that for me is what I have seen is the impact that Christian belief has on leadership in an institution like ours.
From some of my early readings in leadership, communication in general, one of the things I've stumbled upon is the importance of nonverbal communication. What's its place? Does it deserve a lot of time and thinking when it comes to how to be an effective leader, especially in higher education circles, or should the main focus be the delivery of the message itself?
I think it definitely has a high priority. I have a colleague who studies executive presence, and it's interesting because she comes at it from a business perspective. And she and I first started talking about it. I said, everything you're saying is related to nonverbal communication, the facial expression, tone of body, body language, and actually not just how you exhibit that yourself, but also how strong you are in being able to pick that up from other people. Because I've seen many leaders who could not read the room. It's one of the things that I know early speakers in public speaking always struggle with sometimes is if they realize something isn't going over well, they don't know how to adjust in the moment. And so I think those nonverbal expressions, both in the way that we use them and in the way that we read them in other people, are definitely very important to leadership. some of the best leaders I have known are people that, when you walk in to meet with them, they'll notice if something is on your mind or if you're struggling with something. And so, yes, what you say is important. The tone of voice, the facial expression, the body language, the way that you express it to others. And I think you can tell when someone is saying something really kind, but their body language is saying something else. And so if you want your message to really resonate and land, I think it's important to work on those nonverbal skills as well.
Christian higher education has certainly changed during your career, my career, and the field's taking a lot of twists and turns with financial situations and enrollment. It seems like every school has its own set of challenges, and even some schools, sadly, have ceased its existence. And from a leadership standpoint, how can Christian educational leaders best utilize effective communication as they navigate specific challenges they're facing in the kind of demographic that you're looking at smaller Christian liberal arts institutions?
Well, I think the first advice I would give is what I would give to educator, and that is to remember your audience. There are so many distractions and so many ways to get pulled away from your mission, from what you want to accomplish. So I think it's just really important to remember who your audience is. Also, being able to be creative and innovative. One of the things I really appreciate about Campbellsville, we span the gamut. We have programs that are skilled trade programs, certificates, all the way up to doctoral level education in different areas. So we really are trying to meet the needs of the local area, as well as we know a lot of our students are going to go out into the global context or out into the wider world. And so I think being willing to be innovative and not just shut down an idea, even if it's a little outside the box, I think that's really important for institutions going forward. But again, remembering that mission and being able to persuade people to that common purpose. And the only other thing I would say about that is it's really important to make friends. Have a lot of partnerships. We are lucky that we are kind of right here in the Bible Belt. And so sometimes it feels like everyone has the same kinds of goals that we have. But we also have centers out in LA and in Canada, and we want to make friends. And we're not trying to compromise our principles or our mission, but we want to be able to take that out to areas and to people where it may not be the way that they have thought about things in the past. So I think communication is very important in all of that, both the communication for the institution as a whole and for the individual communicators who were out there in the community making those connections.
Many thanks to Dr. Elkins for joining us today on the first episode of the Communication and Educational Leadership series of the Minds of Meaning podcast. I'm going to conclude each episode with 3 big things that I took away from each conversation. First, I think we cannot take for granted the freedoms of being able to think, teach, and communicate in a Christianly manner. As someone who is working on his 3rd degree from a CCCU institution and working at a CCCU institution for 7 years now, it has shown me the perspective of being able to have Christian perspective in the classroom and in our leadership practices. Although Dr. Elkins was able to bring Christian principles to other institutions, it was not until the last decade when she has been able to explicitly integrate faith with education. Second, Dr. Elkins keeps going back to the importance of listening, not only just simply hearing the other person by regurgitating their point and spinning it into your own understanding, but actually listening, hearing the other person out and understanding their viewpoints and their background, and be content with the conversation possibly not leading to an agreeable conclusion can allow us to think more deeply about topics. Dr. Elkins makes a good point that our society pressures us to agree with everything everyone says, or else we will offend or become offended. I love how her hope is that communication can get back to a point where conversations of differing opinions don't lead to complete shutdowns, but rather to an outcome of learning and understanding differences. Third, when I asked the nonverbal communication question to Dr. Elkins, I was not expecting to hear about the tone of voice being associated with nonverbal communication. But the more I think about it, it makes complete sense. One can define nonverbal communication as anything in regards to communication that does not actively include the actual words being conveyed out of the speaker's mouth. And this is why too often we see miscommunication online, because textual communication cannot easily convey the nuances of the tone of voice. So as communicators, we need to be aware of every factor involved in delivering a well-conveyed message. Thank you for listening to the first episode of the Education, Leadership, and Communication series on the Minds of Meaning podcast. I'm Austin Anderson. Until next time.
Thank you for listening to the Minds of Meaning podcast. To learn more about Minds of Meaning, visit mindsofmeaning.com or Minds of Meaning on the mainstream social media platforms. God bless.